Welcome back, horror fans, cinephiles, and Giallo enthusiasts. It's Tanner Leeser, your host for The King in Giallo. This is episode 9 of the Forgotten Giallo film series, 1968 Part 3, the final episode covering the Gialli of this year, and I've got 2 Gialli I'd like to highlight. As always, thanks in no small part to Troy Howarth's book on Giallo cinema, So Deadly, So Perverse, 50 Years of Italian Giallo Films, Volume 1, 1963 to 1973. Like this video and subscribe to The King in Giallo, and do ring that notification bell so those lords of the algorithm may bestow their blessing upon me, and you continue to be presented with weekly Giallo content. This all helps me build my brand here as I fight to get to 1,000 subscribers and get one step closer to monetization here on YouTube. On to the video. The first of 2 Gialli for this video, the 7th of 8, is Run Psycho Run, an Italian and French co-production. It's directed by Brunello Rondi, who co-wrote the film along with Giuseppe Mangione and Vittoriano Petrilli. Music for the film is by Giovanni Fusco. The film stars Gary Merrill as Judge George Dennison, Elga Anderson as Anne and Claire, plus Jorge Riviere, Adriana Asti, Rosella Folk, Michel Lemoyne, and Janine Renaud. The plot of the movie follows George Dennison, an English judge whose life is in upheaval after his wife, named Claire, and their son were murdered in their villa in the Italian countryside. But a year has passed, and George re-enters the villa with his new wife, Anne, who bears an uncanny resemblance to Claire. Anne, being there, seems to pull out the very worst of George's relatives, who may or may not be hiding something. It turns out that George has in fact hired Anne to pretend to be his new wife because she does look exactly like his late wife, and his plan is to use this to lure out the true killer whom he suspects to be one of his greedy relatives. Run Psycho Run was actually filmed in 1965, but did not receive a distribution until the year 1968. The film is one of the most obscure and unseen gialli from the 1960s, and upon its release in the US, it was only released straight to television by American International. Since then, the film has practically lost its English dubbed version, as copies are next to impossible to find. However, this should not lead us to believe that it is a bad film. The film shares themes with Rebecca, 1938, the book from Daphne du Maurier, but leans much deeper into the realm of the psychosexual. Rebecca was adapted to film in 1940 by producer David O. Selznick and directed by Alfred Hitchcock, where it went on to win the Oscar for Best Picture that year. Where the 2 films really differ is concerning the widower. In Rebecca, the movie seems to be playing with the question of whether the widower did in fact murder his wife and is now tormenting his new wife, whom he constantly compares to his late one. Run Psycho Run tends to feel more like an art house film and dedicates itself to its dialogue-driven scenes and its mood to push the narrative along. The aesthetic of the film is great, and the cinematography and the production value overall are considerably above average, showing director Brunello Rondi knows what he is doing. The fact that he chose stark black and white over striking colorful images proves he was motivated to tell a story with a higher emphasis on the psychological. Despite all this, the film may come off as odd or offbeat to some viewers who track it down, and some of those reasons may include things such as a character disappearing from the story near the end with no further explanation, which might be the fault of the lack of an editor being credited, which itself may lend some insights into why this movie sat on the shelf for a few years before it saw the light of day. Lead actor Gary Merrill, a veteran of Hollywood, was born in 1915 in Hartford, Connecticut, and debuted in film in 1943, appearing in wartime documentaries about soldiers' life while he was serving in World War II. In 1949, he appeared in 12 O'Clock High, but found his big break into cinema by appearing in All About Eve, 1950, by Joseph L. Mankiewicz. He co-starred with Bette Davis, whom Merrill married that same year. Merrill remained in the spotlight throughout his career before he retired from acting in 1980. He passed away in 1990. As George, Merrill shows himself to be in top form here, and he endows the character with a great balance of mystery, sympathy, and intrigue. He remains a credible suspect throughout the story's telling, and this is served by his professional performance. Elga Anderson plays the roles of Claire and Anne with a rare determination for this time, as she refuses herself to be relegated to the status of being just a victim. She would appear in more Giallo films to come, including Cross Current, 1971, appearing with Philippe Leroy. Rosella Falk would appear in Black Belly of the Tarantula, 1971. Michael Lemoyne would appear in Death on the Four-Poster, and Janine Renaud would appear in The Case of the Scorpion's Tail, 1971. Future director Demofilo Fidani, who served as the film's art director, would go on to direct the Giallo AAA Masseuse Good Looking Offers Her Services, 1972. Brunello Rondi, writer-director, was born in 1924 and had worked as a screenwriter for Federico Fellini on such masterpieces as La Dolce Vita, 1960, and 8½, 1963, which also had Rosella Falk acting in a supporting role. Both films earned him Oscar nominations along with Fellini, Ennio Flaiano, and Tullio Pinelli. He continued to work on Fellini's screenplays, including Juliet of the Spirits, 1965, and City of Women, 1980. But not just Fellini. Rondi also wrote for Roberto Rossellini on The Flowers of St. Francis, 1950, Europe 51, 1951, and Escape by Night, 1960. He eventually transitioned to director for Violent Life, 1962, which he collaborated on with Paulo Heusch. Rondi's next film was the highly controversial yet forgotten film The Demon, 1963, which predated similar imagery found in William Friedkin's The Exorcist, 1973, by an entire decade. Run's Psycho Run remains his only Giallo film, unless you include his psychological drama film Your Hands on My Body, 1970, which some people do. He passed away at the age of 64 in 1989. And the final Giallo film of 1968 is The Sweet Body of Deborah, an Italian and French co-production. The film is directed by Romolo Guerrieri, written by master Ernesto Gastaldi, with music by Nora Orlandi. The cast consists of Jean Sorel as Marcel, Carol Baker as Deborah, Ida Galli as Susanna Boileau, George Hilton as Robert Simak, Luigi Pistilli as Philip, and Michel Barnet as the Commissioner. The plot follows Marcel after he recently married Deborah, but eventually he discovers that his former lover, Susanna, had ended her life. Threats begin to appear against the newlyweds from a man who was in love with Susanna, Philip, who blames Marcel for the tragedy. Marcel's cries for help to the local police fall upon deaf ears as they refuse to investigate the matter. This is another Giallo that owes its premise to the French thriller film Les Diaboliques, 1955, by Henri-Georges Clouzot, which Gastaldi adapted into the Giallo format, which, at the time, proved to be such a hit that it spawned a run of erotic thrillers. The story is similar to the film which inspired it, but the action and the pacing keeps the plot driving much more so. The film has a hint of melancholy flavoring its tone, but it does not lament on this. The movie is inundated with flashy pop art dressing the set, which brings an abundance of color. It should also be noted that if the film comes off as being predictable, it is because this film was one of the progenitors of its type, and the success of this film inspired filmmakers later to follow suit and utilize the same exploits found here. The cast in the picture yields several actors who would appear in many more Giallo films in the coming years. Leading man Jean Sorel, born in 1934 in France, rose to stardom by appearing in films such as Sandra, 1965 by Luchino Visconti, and Belle du Jour, 1967 by Louis Buñuel. Some gialli he would appear in would include Perversion Story, 1969 by Lucio Fulci, and A Quiet Place to Kill, 1970 by Umberto Lenzi. Sorel was originally cast in Diabolic when Seth Holt was the director, but when Mario Bava took the reins, the role would go to John Philip Law. Through the following decades, he would switch between genre fare and more serious type pictures, and has been doing very well in recent years in Italian television. In The Sweet Body of Deborah, he brings a strong performance as the curious yet morally broken Marcel, seeking revenge. Carol Baker plays Deborah, herself a soon-to-be female icon within the genre. She was born in 1931 in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and after landing a contract with Warner Brothers in the 1950s, she started appearing in films beginning with Giant, 1956 by George Stevens, and Baby Doll, 1956 by Elia Kazan, which earned her an Oscar nomination for her work. She eventually made her way to Europe, where she began appearing in genre flicks through the 1960s and into the 70s, before she ultimately returned back home to the States and started making TV appearances. Later on, she would appear in The Game, 1997 by David Fincher. Afterwards, she retired from acting in the early 2000s. Her performance in The Sweet Body of Deborah is great, and together with Sorel, they have great chemistry on screen and do work well off of each other. Also in the film is a Giallo regular, George Hilton. He was born in 1934 in Uruguay and had begun his acting career in Argentinian films, then moved to Italy where he got involved in spaghetti westerns, spy thrillers, and Giallo films. As much as Baker would become synonymous with Lenzi's Gialli, Hilton would do the same, but with the Gialli of Sergio Martino. He would appear alongside another iconic diva of Giallo cinema, Edwige Fenech, in such Gialli as The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, 1971, All the Colors of the Dark, 1972, both by Sergio Martino, and The Case of the Bloody Iris, 1972, directed by Giuliano Carnemeo. George's good looks made it easy for him to be cast as both handsome heroes and seductive villains, and it was very common to see him playing both good guys who turned out to be bad boys, or the inverse of that. But what makes him stand out compared to other actors of the time who were typecast in such roles was that George could act really well. He also had a talent for comedy infusions into his straight roles. He worked well into the 90s, but his career has slowed a bit down in the more recent years. Luigi Pistilli plays Philip, the antagonist. He was born in 1929 in Tuscany. He was often typecast in villainous roles, but he was more than just a sinister face, as he would prove to be adept at garnering sympathy from the audiences. Beyond acting, Luigi was also a gifted playwright. Fans of spaghetti westerns will recognize him from such classics as For a Few Dollars More, 1965, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 1966, both by Sergio Leone, as well as the western In the Snow, The Great Silence, 1968, by Sergio Corbucci. Giallo fans will know him from films such as The Case of the Scorpion's Tail, 1971, by Sergio Martino, The Iguana with the Tongue of Fire, 1971, by Ricardo Frida, and A Bay of Blood, also called Twitch of the Death Nerve, also 1971, by Mario Bava. Sadly, Pistilli fell victim to depression and ended things in 1996 after a breakup with his girlfriend. Ida Galli, under the pseudonym of Evelyn Stewart, plays Susanna. She was born in 1942 and appeared in La Dolce Vita by Fellini and The Leopard, 1963, by Visconti. The genre flicks she acted in include The Whip and the Body, 1963, by Mario Bava, and Mexican Sleigh Ride, 1967, by Ricardo Frida. The other gialli she would appear in were The Weekend Murders, 1970, by Michele Lupo, Knife of Ice, 1972, by Umberto Lenzi, and Arabella Black Angel, 1989, by Stelvio Massi. The director of this giallo star-studded film, Romolo Guerrieri, real name Romolo Girolami, competently moves the film's narrative forward at a nice and steady pace while focusing much more on the characters and the plot than he does on the exploits such as the gore or the sleaze like some other directors might. Despite his tame handling of the material, the film proves itself to be rather classy and less interested in winning you over with stylistic abundance. He was born in 1931 and is the brother to Marino Girolami and uncle to Enzo G. Castellari. The only other giallo film he would direct is The Double, 1971, which also had Jean Sorel as its star. Guerrieri was more prolific in the polizieschi genre with such films as Un Detective, 1969, with Franco Nero, and The Police Serve the Citizens, 1973, with Enrico Maria Salerno. He was a competent director, but not a considerably talented one, not like Lucio Fulci or Umberto Lenzi could be regarded as. Together with his cinematographer, Marcello Masciocchi, they create some compelling scenes with wonderful use of colors and even pull off a shot which would be emulated in A Bay of Blood, utilizing a struggle with two characters who slip out of frame, resulting in a death, but keeping the audience guessing who killed who. Last crew shout-out goes to Nora Orlandi, the composer, who succeeds in delivering a truly effective score from scene to scene. Born in 1933, she would work as a composer and a vocalist for a few films until she retired in 1973. Some of her other credits include Johnny Yuma, 1966 by Guerrieri, Death at Owell Rock, 1967 by Frida, and her singing voice can be heard in Death Walks at Midnight, 1972 in the song Valentina, composed by Gianni Ferrio. In conclusion, The Sweet Body of Deborah is a solid entry into the landscape of Giallo cinema, and although it may not be as flashy as some come to expect from the genre, it would set the stage for films from Umberto Lenzi and Lucio Fulci, who seem to be the most inspired by what is put on display here. The trope of the use of music used repeatedly to drive another character into madness would be seen in Orgasmo by Lenzi and Double Face by Frida. Let me say here that in my last video covering Orgasmo, I stated in text on the screen, as well as in the description of the video, that it wasn't until I was nearly done with the edit that I had realized that The Sweet Body of Deborah was in fact released before Orgasmo. I'm very open about my use of the book So Sweet, So Perverse by Troy Howarth as my main source of research and my Giallo guide for doing my videos in a chronological order. I find this book to be better than the internet sources I also use, but for the life of me, I do not know why he has Orgasmo placed in the section for 1968. Maybe he has a reason for it, but I could not find that. He doesn't mention it in his description that it was in production early but held off until 1969. So, for all intents and purposes, Orgasmo is absolutely inspired in part by this film, and I was initially misled into thinking that it coincidentally came out the same year before The Sweet Body of Deborah, where every internet search I tried told me it had come out nearly 11 months after it, in February of 1969. I don't blame Troy Howarth for that. I'm sure he has a reason. It's just I could not find what that reason was. So it's not the biggest deal, but I have been trying to do these in a chronological order so we can see the evolution of this genre as it happened. So for me, it was kind of a bummer to realize a mistake was being made on my part. I digress though. I hope you enjoy the videos nonetheless. The Sweet Body of Deborah does not seem to have a US DVD or Blu-ray release, which is a total shame. I cannot seem to guess why that might be. This film seems to be a landmark in the genre, and it seems a crime that it does not have a restoration and proper home video release. Get on that shit, Arrow, or Vinegar Syndrome. And those are the Giallo films for 1968. I hope you learned something new, and if you are interested in watching these movies, look them up online. If you do watch them, or you've already seen them, I invite you to leave your thoughts on them in the comments. Always welcome. Follow The King in Giallo on Instagram, and give a like to The King in Giallo on Facebook. Subscribe here on YouTube if you aren't already, and join me every week for new Giallo film content. Upcoming content for The King in Giallo will be episode 10 of the Forgotten Giallo film series, 1969 Part 1, then the overview, review, and Gialli-tally for the 1969 Proto Giallo Double Face, directed by Riccardo Frida and starring Klaus Kinski. Thank you all very much for your continued support. This is Tanner Leeser for The King in Giallo, and if nothing else, I'll see you next time.